When you run into the man who buried you alive, you're supposed to feel rage or terror or at least a spike of adrenaline. Instead, I'm watching this massive alpha drop into the dirt, crying and begging me to say his name, and my chest is completely empty. 3 years sealed in a dark vault will break your brain if you let it. To survive, I used my own weaving magic to cut him out of my head, thread by thread until there was nothing left to hurt. He's looking at me like I'm his wife back from the dead. I just see a very large stranger making a mess on his own steps. Chapter 1. Blood soaked the woven rug in the crime scene photo, but Talia felt nothing at all. She studied the image. A man torn apart from the inside out, in a room locked from the inside. No broken windows, no forced entry, an impossible murder. Yet her pulse kept a slow, steady rhythm. She liked the cold logic of a puzzle. It was safe. She stood in the white archives of the Continental Alpha Assembly. The room smelled sharply of ozone and old parchment, a sterile, clean scent that grounded her and kept the mess of the outside world at bay. Elder Silas dropped a thick manila folder onto the crystal desk with a heavy thud. "The Alpha of the Northern Ridge requested our help," Silas said, his voice a low, scratchy rumble. "2 of his pack members are dead, both found in locked vaults. The local enforcers are terrified." Talia kept her eyes on the photo. "A psychic anomaly," she murmured. "Exactly. A memory weaver, perhaps. Someone who can step into a mind and force the body to tear itself apart. We need our best psychic detective on this." Talia finally looked up. As a memory weaver herself, she carried a forbidden, dangerous power, the ability to extract, alter, and view the traumatic memories of shifters. If the continent's ruling warlords ever found out, they would enslave her as a mind weapon in a heartbeat. The assembly protected her only because she was useful. Just last week, she had excised a traumatized child's memory, snipping the dark thread of fear from the boy's mind like loose string. She erased memories because pain was a fatal weakness. "Who is the Alpha?" she asked, her voice level. "His name is Alpha Kale." A strange phantom ache bloomed deep in her chest, sharp and heavy, like someone pressing a hand against her lungs. She frowned, her fingers drifting to her sternum. Why did the sound of a stranger's name carry physical weight? "Are you all right, investigator?" Silas asked. "I am fine," Talia lied. She reached out and brushed her finger over the inked borders of Kale's territory on the mat inside the folder. Instantly, her hand began to tremble so violently the paper rattled against the glass desk. She snatched her hand back, her breath catching. She stared at her fingers in shock. Her mind was perfectly clear, devoid of fear or pity. Why was her body reacting like she was standing on the edge of a cliff? "I will pack my kits," Talia said quietly, curling her shaking hand into a tight fist inside her coat pocket. An hour later, Talia sat in the back of a heavily armored transport vehicle, while rain lashed against the thick glass windows. The sky outside had turned a bruised, dark purple as they drove deep into the pine forests of the northern ridge. The sterile smell of the assembly was gone, replaced by the heavy scent of rain-soaked pine and damp earth creeping through the air vents. It made her skin crawl. Across from her, Vane, a rogue intellect, tactical advisor, and the closest thing she had to family, tapped a silver pen against his chin while reviewing the case files. "This Alpha Kale is a brute," Vane muttered, flipping a page. "His territory is locked down tight. No one gets in or out without his permission. The fact that he called the assembly for help means he's losing control of his pack." "Or he is the killer," Talia said flatly. She looked down at the photograph of Kale in her lap. Broad shoulders, dark messy hair, and intense golden eyes. As she stared at his face, the ache in her chest returned, sharper this time, like a burn right over her heart. She rubbed her chest to massage it away. Her muscle memory seemed to recall something her brain didn't, which infuriated her. 3 years ago, she had woken up in the assembly hospital with a wiped mind, a clean slate she accepted gladly because an empty past meant survival. "You look pale, Talia," Vane noted, watching her closely. "Are you feeling the psychic residue already?" "No," she said, her voice betraying the slightest tremor. "It is just cold in here." "Well, button up. We are crossing his borders now. Keep your shields up. This pack is dangerous." Talia closed her eyes and focused on her breathing, visualizing thick walls of white ice forming around her mind. She was a professional, untouchable, yet beneath the ice her pulse raced. The smell of damp earth made her feel like she was suffocating, and she didn't know what scared her more, the locked room murders or the fact that her own body was keeping a secret from her. The heavy vehicle slowed to a stop, tires crunching against wet gravel. Talia pushed the heavy metal door open and stepped out into the freezing rain, her boots splashing into a deep puddle. Before her stood the sprawling stone estate of the pack house, surrounded by towering dark trees. At the top of the stone steps stood Alpha Kale. The moment their eyes met, a jolt of static ripped through her veins, hot, sudden, and consuming. She stopped breathing. He was even bigger in person, his broad chest rising and falling heavily under a dark shirt, his fists clenched at his sides. But his golden eyes shattered her defenses completely. They were filled with raw, desperate devotion and unmistakable heartbreak. Her heart skipped a beat. Every alarm bell in her logical mind told her to step back from a gaze that felt too hot, too intimate, too dangerous. Instead, she stood her ground, forcing her face into an emotionless mask to project absolute authority. "Alpha Kale," she said, her voice detached and smooth. "I am investigator Talia. I am here to take over this crime scene." Kale didn't look at her badge, or at Vane stepping out behind her. He only looked at Talia, like she was a ghost climbing out of a grave. He walked down the wet stone stairs, the tension tightening with every step until he stopped just inches away. He was close enough that she could feel the rolling heat radiating from his skin, carrying the scent of rain, pine, and raw power. Moving on pure instinct, Talia tilted her chin up, exposing her neck slightly, a submissive shifter trait she didn't even know she possessed. Kale leaned down, his face inches from hers. "My sweet little archive keeper," he whispered, his voice broken and gravelly. "You came back to me." Talia froze, her eyes widening. The name hit her like a physical blow. She had never heard it before in her life, yet it echoed in her bones like an old song. Before she could find her voice, a mechanical howl tore through the woods behind the manor, shattering the moment and signaling that the hunt had already begun. The mechanical howl died out, leaving a heavy silence in the woods. Talia blinked the static from her eyes and fell back on assembly training. Shut the door on the adrenaline, lock the mind down, focus on the problem. She walked past Kale without looking at him and headed for the manor's heavy oak doors, Vane close behind her. "I need to see the victim," she said. "Lead the way." A draft hit the porch, carrying the unmistakable scent of copper from deep inside the house. Old blood. Kale moved faster than a man his size should be able to. He cut her off at the basement archway, his shoulders blocking the entire frame. A low rumble started in his chest, and for just a second, his eyes looked less like a warlord's and more like a trapped animal's. "No," he said, his voice scraping his throat. "You can't go in there." "Step aside, Alpha." He didn't budge. His hands gripped the stone doorframe until his knuckles turned white. He looked cornered, the exact same look she'd seen on a rogue shifter, right before they closed the door on an assembly cage. "I'm protecting you," he choked out. Talia didn't argue. She dropped her weight, ducked under his arm, and hooked her foot behind his boot. One quick twist of her hips, and she swept his legs clean out from under him. He hit the wall with a heavy thud, gasping in surprise, while she slipped past and popped the vault's iron latch. Then she froze, her hand resting on the cold metal. They didn't teach that takedown in the assembly archives. It was a close-quarters shifter move, intimate, dirty, and specific. Where had she learned it? Her body knew how to handle him, even if her brain didn't. She shook the thought away, pushed the heavy door open, and walked into the dark. Kale looked defeated as he followed her down the steps. The air inside the vault was dead and freezing. On the metal slab in the center of the room lay what was left of the Pax Beta. Talia walked to the edge of the table, pulling off her leather gloves. A faint, silver psychic light began to pulse at the tips of her fingers. "Don't touch him," Kale said, his voice echoing off the concrete. She ignored him and pressed her fingers against the dead man's temples, reaching for a memory thread. The connection snapped shut like a bear trap. It wasn't a memory, it was a psychic minefield. A looping, violent blast of pure agony, left behind as a tripwire. Blinding white light filled her vision as she screamed. The feedback hit her like a physical blow to the chest, throwing her backward off her feet. She braced for the crack of the stone floor, but hit solid muscle instead. Cale caught her midair, wrapping his arms around her waist, and taking the brunt of the impact as they slid to the ground together. Talia gasped for breath, her head spinning, while the dark room slowly came back into focus. A warm drop of blood trickled from her nostril, down to her lip. Before she could wipe it away, Cale's hand was there, with a soft, damp cloth, pressing it gently against her face. The movement was practiced, careful. "I told you," he whispered, his chest heaving against her back. "It isn't safe." Talia stared at the wall, her limbs heavy. Why did he have a cloth ready? Why did the way he held her feel like an old habit? She scrambled to her feet and backed away from him, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her entire life was built on verifiable facts, but her muscle memory was telling her a story her brain refused to accept. "The killer is a memory weaver," she said, wiping her face with her sleeve. They booby-trapped his mind. If she was going to track someone who could leave a psychic bomb in a dead man's skull, she needed complete control of the territory. Upstairs, the great hall was packed with 36 wolves, none of them happy. The pack elders sat at the long tables, watching Talia with an unsettling mix of fear and quiet, heavy pity. The hearth fire cast nervous shadows across the stone walls. Talia stood near the flames. Vane stood beside her, holding out a silver assembly contract. "I can't do my job if your people are actively fighting me," Talia said, her voice carrying easily over the low growls in the room. "I need absolute jurisdiction. You have to formally submit the pack to my authority." A few of the wolves shifted aggressively. Making an alpha kneel in his own house was a calculated insult. Cale didn't argue. The room went completely silent as he walked up to the hearth, dropped heavily onto one knee, and bowed his head. "I surrender my jurisdiction to you, investigator," he said. The moment the words left his mouth, his entire body seized up. His hands gripped his thighs so hard his knuckles turned white, and a thick vein pulsed visibly in his neck. He looked like he was fighting off a stroke. A drop of blood appeared on his lower lip, where he was biting down. An alpha of his size shouldn't be sweating over an oath of fealty. Talia watched him closely, a cold knot forming in her stomach. For a fraction of a second, the gold in his eyes vanished, replaced by a flat, empty black, before the gold fought its way to the surface again. "Are you unwell, Alpha Cale?" she asked. He blinked hard, his chest heaving as if he'd just sprinted up a mountain. "I'm fine," he ground out. He wasn't. The sharp, sour smell of terror was coming off him in waves. Something was attacking him from the inside, and he was losing ground. 36 pairs of eyes tracked her from the second she walked in. The meeting room smelled like wet fur, old paper, and nervous sweat, a thick, suffocating mix that turned her stomach. Talia stood at the head of the oak table. She wanted timelines, incident reports, and clean facts. What she got was a room full of pack elders, staring at her with wet, glistening eyes. The pity on their faces felt worse than a knife at her throat. Back at the assembly, she'd once seen a woman look at her dead son with that exact same expression, ruined by a loss she couldn't fix. But Talia was standing right here, alive. Why were they mourning her to her face? "I need the patrol logs from the night of the murder," she said, keeping her tone flat. Elder Silas didn't answer. He just blinked at her, his hands shaking slightly as he pushed a piece of rough paper across the wood. As he moved, she caught the light hitting the silver rings on his fingers. The carved emblem matched the faded scar on her left shoulder, down to the millimeter. A cold wave of unease hit her, but she shoved it aside. She was here to solve a murder, not chase coincidences about her missing history. "The vault was locked," she said, ignoring the paper. "How did the killer bypass the iron seals?" Nobody answered. The elders just exchanged darting, nervous glances across the table. It felt like being the only person in a room who missed the punchline to a bad joke, except nobody was laughing. At the far end of the room, a gray-haired woman dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. "We thought you were gone forever," the old woman whispered. Talia's pulse spiked. She slammed both hands onto the wood, the crack echoing off the stone walls. "I am Investigator Talia," she snapped. "I am not a ghost. Answer my questions." The silence stretched out, heavy and thick. The fire crackled in the hearth behind her. "We are deeply sorry, Luna," Silas whispered. He bowed his head. The word Luna hit her like a physical blow. A blinding spark of psychic feedback short-circuited her mental shielding, leaving her gasping for air. She stumbled backward away from the table and bolted out of the room, desperate for fresh air, before the engineered emptiness in her head cracked wide open. Fear is a quiet, freezing poison. It creeps into your system before you realize you're shivering. Talia stood alone on a high stone balcony, gripping the cold iron railing until her knuckles paled. She breathed in the sharp, rainy air, trying to slow her mind down. The phantom ache in her chest had spread into her ribs now, deep and persistent. Below her, the courtyard was a patchwork of pale moonlight and dark shadows moving with the clouds. Then she saw him. Down in the mud, Cale was pacing back and forth like a caged animal. He was completely alone, muttering to himself, his massive shoulders hunched against the cold. What kind of threat makes an alpha of his strength cower in his own backyard? He dropped to his knees in the wet dirt and grabbed his head with both hands. Then he raised his right arm. Thick, sharp claws popped from his knuckles with a dry crunch. Before Talia could process what she was seeing, he dragged those claws down his left forearm. Dark blood spilled onto the grass. She leaned over the railing, her breath catching. He gritted his teeth, tearing his own skin over and over, and he actually looked relieved. He was using the sharp physical pain to anchor himself, fighting off a massive psychic intrusion by drowning it in bodily trauma. She'd seen this once before, a rogue shifter who clawed his own eyes out just to make the hallucinations stop. Cale was walking that exact same tightrope above total madness. A fierce protective wave hit her out of nowhere. She wanted to vault the railing and stop him from hurting himself. What was the buzzing static she could almost hear vibrating in the air around him? The wind shifted, carrying the smell of his blood up to the balcony. Copper and pine. Her stomach clenched. Cale froze. He slowly lifted his head toward the balcony. When his eyes found hers across the darkness, her heart hammered against her ribs. His gaze was wide, feral, and full of crushing shame. He knew she'd just watched him tear himself apart. Terrified that whatever was breaking his mind might be contagious, Talia spun around and hurried back into the dark stone halls. The smell of blood always hits you before you see the mess. At dawn, blaring sirens ripped Talia out of her restless sleep. She grabbed the silver assembly blade from her nightstand and threw open her door. The hallway was freezing, and the floor right outside her room was covered in red. A young pack guard lay motionless on the stone, his chest torn wide open. Another impossible murder, delivered directly to her threshold. Then she saw Cale standing over the body. His hands were dripping with fresh blood. His chest heaved as he turned his head slowly to look at her. His eyes weren't their usual warm gold. They were flat, empty, and pitch black. He looked completely feral, the protector turned predator. Talia didn't back down. She raised her glowing silver blade, gripping the hilt tight. Every logical neuron in her brain told her he was the killer. He had the blood on his hands. He was standing right over the corpse. Yet her gut screamed just as loudly that he was innocent. How do you arrest a man when standing near him feels like coming home? "Step away from the body, Alpha," she said, keeping her voice steady. Instead of obeying, he took a heavy step toward her, holding up his bloody hands. The air thickened between them. He stared at her with those dead black eyes, clearly fighting whatever invisible force had hijacked his nervous system. Deep down, her wolf, a wild instinct she hadn't even known was buried inside her, let out a low snarl of warning. Assembly enforcers swarmed into the hallway behind her, heavy iron restraints clanking in their hands. Left with no logical choice, Talia pointed her blade at Cale's bloody chest and ordered him bound in chains. The iron door groaned on its hinges, letting in a draft of cold, damp air. Talia stepped into the stairwell. It smelled of rust, old sweat and mold, a heavy mix that stuck in her throat. She walked down the steps, her boots clicking against the concrete. The holding cell at the bottom was pitch dark, except for a single yellow bulb hanging by a cord. Water dripped somewhere in the corner. Cale was chained to the far wall. Silver-laced cuffs locked his wrists and ankles, forcing him to his knees. His head hung low, his chin resting against his chest, dried blood flaking on his collarbone. The silver in the room dampened psychic energy, which gave her a rare moment of mental quiet. "Look at me, Alpha," she said. He didn't move. He kept his eyes fixed on the wet floor. Her jaw tightened. She'd interrogated dozens of violent criminals who pulled the silent treatment. Once, a warlord bit off his own tongue during a questioning just to spite her, bleeding out on the table with a smile. Was Cale trying to pull something similar? Then she heard it. He was humming under his breath, a slow, looping melody. The sound made the old scar on her left shoulder throb. She pushed the sensation away. She needed facts, not ghost pains. "You were found covered in blood," she said, setting her recorder on a barrel. Standing directly over the guard's body. "The vault was locked from the inside. You had motive and opportunity. Just confess." He raised his head. When his eyes met hers, they weren't pitch black anymore. They were a dull, exhausted gold. There was no rage in him at all. Just a crushing, quiet grief. "I can't," he rasped. His throat sounded like it was lined with sandpaper. Why was he fighting so hard to stay quiet? She took a step toward him, determined to crack whatever he was holding back. She looked at the heavy iron chains around his wrists, completely missing that the real lock was inside his head. Talia dropped her clipboard onto the stone. It hit with a sharp crack that echoed off the damp walls. She was done waiting. If he wouldn't talk, she'd just take it. She was an assembly memory weaver. Pulling truth out of stubborn minds was what they paid her for. "If you won't speak, I'll make you show me," she said. She closed the distance and dropped to her knees in front of him, grabbing his wrists. His skin was burning hot, like a fever breaking. "No," Cale yelled, trying to jerk his hands back. Too late. Her fingers pressed into the skin at his pulse points, and the psychic link snapped shut. The cell disappeared. She braced herself for a visual memory of the attack, but not for the sight of claws tearing into the guard. Instead, she got hit with a wall of pure emotion. No pictures, no sound, just an overwhelming tidal wave of grief, fierce loyalty, and a love so heavy it knocked the wind out of her lungs. "Ah," she gasped, her back arching. The mental barriers she'd relied on for 3 years cracked wide open. The sterile emptiness in her head flooded with heat. It was an intense, desperate attachment aimed directly at her, a connection she had somehow surgically removed from her own memory. Why would anyone volunteer to erase something that strong? Her chest physically hurt, and her eyes stung. She couldn't breathe through the sheer weight of what was radiating off him. It felt like waking up from anesthesia during surgery, and realizing what was missing. She wrenched her hands back, breaking the link, and stumbled onto the floor. She sat there in the dirt, staring at him with wide eyes, her fingers shaking uncontrollably. "What did you do to me?" she whispered into the dark. For the first time since she woke up in the assembly hospital, she felt a wild instinct stir deep in her gut, and realized her entire identity had been fabricated. Cale strained against the chains, the metal groaning as he pulled. His eyes flared with a desperate, protective panic. Seeing her on the floor shaking tore through his remaining defenses. He couldn't keep lying to her. "I didn't break you, Talia," he choked out, his voice cracking. "The puppeteer did." The floor suddenly lurched beneath them. A dull, heavy explosion rumbled through the building above, shaking the foundation. Dust and loose gravel rained down from the ceiling as the yellow bulb flickered, popped, and plunged the cell into total darkness. A second later, a psychic shockwave hit the room. It slammed into Talia like a physical blow, leaving her ears ringing with high-pitched static. It was the same intrusive hum she'd felt on the balcony earlier, but amplified. Whoever was manipulating the pack's minds was making a direct assault on the manor. "They're here," Cale yelled into the dark, his chains rattling furiously against the stone. Sirens started blaring outside, the muffled sound bleeding through the ceiling. Talia scrambled to her feet in the pitch black, her head pounding. The air vent above them carried the smell of burnt ozone and fresh blood. Her enforcers were up there, taking casualties. With her team actively bleeding, the fear in her chest evaporated, replaced by a cold, operational focus. She pulled her psychic defenses back together. "Unchain me," Cale demanded, pulling at the wall anchors until the concrete cracked. "Let me protect you." She stood there in the dark with the iron key in her hand, hesitating. Could she trust a man tied to her own erased trauma? She listened to the chaos upstairs, knowing the killer was already inside the house, and that she couldn't stop this alone. The iron ring slipped through her fingers and hit the stone floor with a sharp clang. Instead of fumbling for the locks in the dark, Talia dropped to her knees. A physical key wasn't going to stop what was happening inside his head. She needed his memories. She reached out blindly until her palms found his face. His skin burned like a fever. She pressed her thumbs against his temples and forced the psychic link open. A blinding flash of silver light wiped out the dark. Diving into an unstable mind without assembly oversight wasn't just breaking protocol. It was treason. She was throwing away her career, her safety, and her clean slate just to keep him from drowning. The damp cell vanished. She dropped into the turbulent ocean of Kale's alpha consciousness. His mind looked like a sprawling forest of bright golden light, but it was being choked to death. Thick, black vines of psychic static wrapped around the trees, crushing his core memories under their weight. The rogue memory weaver was actively hijacking his nervous system. That was why Kale had let them chain him to the wall. He was fighting a war inside his own skull, locking up his physical body, so his claws wouldn't tear her apart when he lost control. Talia pushed deeper into the dark vines, hunting for his true memories, before the concrete ceiling above them gave way. Inside his mind, he wasn't chained to a wall. Kale's avatar stood tall in the glowing forest. When Talia's presence entered the clearing, the warmth of his mind wrapped around her. The collision sent a shockwave through the trees, a sudden electric recognition of two pieces snapping back together. She felt everything he'd been keeping in, the desperate longing, the grief, and a fierce suffocating devotion. His hands cupped her face. "You came back," his voice echoed through the trees. Her breath caught. "I'm here." The sheer weight of it broke through what was left of her mental armor. The clinical detachment she'd lived by for 3 years simply dissolved. Her instincts had recognized him from the second she stepped out of the transport, and now her brain caught up. He was her mate. They crashed together in a desperate embrace, driven by a bond refusing to stay buried. Then she caught a stray scent lingering in the background of the trauma, burnt sage. Why would the signature scent of a high-ranking assembly elder be tangled up in the psychic static attacking Kale's brain? Before she could trace it, the forest shook. A jagged spike of black static tore through the sky above them. The rogue weaver had realized she was inside the Alpha's mind and launched a direct assault on her consciousness. The black vines whipped forward, tearing Kale away from her and violently ejecting her from the link. Talia's body convulsed on the wet concrete. She gasped for air, her lungs burning as the real world rushed back in. The psychic blast had cleanly severed the connection, leaving her ears ringing with high-pitched feedback. The holding cell was coming down around them. Chunks of rock and dust rained from the ceiling. Then a scream echoed down the stairwell. It was Vane. Her heart skipped a beat. Her team was taking casualties right above her. A cold, absolute fury wiped away the disorientation. With the threat right outside, Kale let out a deafening roar. Using pure physical strength, he braced against the wall anchors until the iron chain snapped. The metal exploded outward onto the floor. They bolted up the crumbling stairs and burst into the courtyard. The air was thick with black smoke. Kale shifted mid-stride into a massive, silver-tipped wolf, baring his teeth as he scanned the dark for targets. Talia froze. Vane lay motionless on the wet grass. In his right hand, he gripped a silver assembly key, the specific kind used to access restricted archive vaults. Her professional facade completely evaporated. Whoever had wiped her memory had just murdered the closest thing she had to family. She walked straight to Vane's body, her hands glowing with a bright, volatile psychic light. Matching the low snarl of the wolf beside her, she pressed her fingers against Vane's temples and threw her unprotected mind into the residual tripwire waiting inside him. Touching a dead mind felt like plunging bare hands into ice water and broken glass. The trap snapped shut around her fingers before she could pull back. Whoever killed Vane was waiting inside his fading neural pathways, and the backlash yanked Talia into a blinding wall of static. That was when she realized what the killer was actually after. Vane wasn't just a target. He was a tripwire designed to drop her shields and blow open a back door into Kale's head. A bone-crunching shift echoed behind her. She spun around. Kale's golden eyes rolled back, flashing white, before settling into a flat, dead black. He was gone. The wolf shifted back into human form, his limbs moving with a jerky, unnatural gait, like a puppet on tight strings. As he closed the distance, the sharp, sour smell of terror rolled off his skin. He was fighting the intrusion from the inside, but he wasn't winning. Talia reached for her silver blade and froze. She couldn't bring herself to draw it on him. That half-second hesitation cost her everything. His blood-stained hands closed around her throat, lifting her off her feet and cutting off her air. Her body went limp in his grip while her mind dropped through the floor into a claustrophobic nightmare. The smoky courtyard vanished. She was lying on a cold lead slab in pitch darkness. Above her came the dull, heavy thud of dirt hitting wood. She was locked in a coffin. It was the exact memory she'd had surgically removed 3 years ago. The raw panic hit her lungs like concrete. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't make a sound. Her mind started fracturing under the weight of it. A distorted illusion of Kale materialized above the dirt, looking down at her with empty eyes. "You're nothing to me," the phantom said. The lie cut deeper than the suffocation. Her psychic avatar began to fray at the edges, turning to ash as the death loop chewed through her identity. Then a stubborn instinct kicked in deep in her chest, a lingering trace of warmth from the real Kale's touch in the forest. She grabbed onto that memory like a lifeline, holding it against the surrounding dark. The pressure around her windpipe vanished. In the real world, Kale let out a ragged, agonizing roar. He fought through the control strings just hard enough to buy himself 3 seconds of physical movement. He scooped her off the wet grass and ran. His boots tore through the mud as he sprinted for the dark edge of the territory, heading straight for the silent sepulchre. The lead-lined tomb at the border was the only place on the mountain where psychic currents couldn't reach. It was also the exact spot where her trauma started. He threw them both through the iron doorway and into the narrow vault, taking the heavy door shut behind them. Absolute darkness swallowed the room. The deafening static in her head cut out instantly. Talia gasped, sucking cold, damp air into her burning lungs. She was alive, but she was sealed in a pitch-black vault with a bleeding alpha who might lose control again at any second. In the dark, she listened to the ragged sound of his breathing, waiting. The vault was pitch black. Talia lay flat on the concrete, unable to see her own hands or the walls around her. In the dark, Kale's ragged breathing sounded loud and uneven. The heavy lead of the tomb blocked the psychic network completely. The static that had been tearing at her mind cut out, leaving a ringing silence in her ears. She pushed herself up and reached out blindly through the dark until her fingers brushed Kale's chest. His skin was soaked with sweat and burning hot. He flinched. "Don't," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "I might hurt you." Talia didn't pull back. She slid closer to him on the floor. He was exhausted from fighting the control strings, leaving his natural mental shielding completely dropped. Without that armor, his emotions spilled directly into her touch, crushing guilt, remorse, and a protectiveness so fierce it felt almost painful. That was when the key in Vane's dead hand made sense. Vane hadn't just died in the courtyard. He had found physical evidence back at the assembly archives and brought it here to give to her. The rogue weaver hadn't followed her to the northern ridge. He had sent her here in the first place to walk into a trap. Talia leaned forward and pressed her forehead against Kale's hot chest. "Show me," she whispered. "Show me what happened 3 years ago." A memory opened up in the dark of her mind. Talia closed her eyes and let Kale's unedited past wash over her. She saw the night 3 years ago with terrifying clarity. She watched Kale's silver wolf turn on her under the rogue weaver's control. She felt his internal horror as his own muscles betrayed him. She felt him fight through the control strings, just hard enough to wrench his limbs back for 3 seconds. In that tiny window, his memory self threw her into this exact lead-lined tomb and slammed the iron door shut. He locked her inside and locked himself outside with the madness so she would survive. Talia gasped in the dark. He'd spent 3 years thinking she would hate him for it if she ever found out. He expected her to scream or run. Instead, she wrapped her arms around his neck. He had trapped her in the dark to keep his own claws from tearing her apart, and he'd carried the weight of that choice alone ever since. She felt hot tears drop onto her shoulder. The alpha was silently crying in the dark. "I'm sorry," he choked out. She reached up and found his face, wiping the moisture from his jaw with her thumbs. "You didn't bury me to kill me," she said quietly. The blocked memories flooded back all at once. She remembered his deep laugh, the nights they'd spent tangled in his sheets, and the way he had always treated her as an equal. Her erased childhood trauma merged with her analytical assembly training, and the combination unlocked something sharp and volatile in her head. Then the last piece fell into place. The scent of burnt sage from the mental link. "It was Elder Silas," Talia growled into the dark. "Silas is the rogue weaver. He sent us here to die so he could claim the territory." Silas was waiting right outside the vault door with a pack of hijacked wolves. But Talia wasn't an amnesiac investigator anymore. The tomb wasn't a prison. It was the place where her mind finally healed. When she stood up, her blue eyes glowed so brightly they cast a faint silver reflection against the damp stone. Beside her, Cale stood up too, his golden eyes clear and focused. She grabbed his face and pulled him into a hard, desperate kiss. "Are you ready, Alpha?" she whispered. He answered with a low rumble in his chest. Together, they turned toward the iron door and braced themselves to break out. Cale kicked the lead door hard enough to shear the hinges. It crashed outward onto the wet grass. Outside, Elder Silas stood in the rain, wearing a clean white assembly uniform, flanked by 10 wolves. Their eyes were solid black, jaws dripping saliva. Silas looked pleased with himself. The locked room murders had done their job framing Cale, and now he had the numbers to finish it. "Kill them both," Silas said. The wolves lunged. Cale shifted midair, his silver-tipped coat catching the light just before he collided with the front 3. Teeth snapped, and blood sprayed across the grass. Talia didn't draw a weapon. She dropped to her knees in the mud. With Cale taking the physical brunt of the attack, she finally had room to work the network. She pressed her palms flat against the cold dirt and pushed her mind outward. Inside the local web, Silas's influence looked like thick, dark roots choking the wolves' nervous systems. She didn't try to untangle them cleanly. She grabbed the roots with her mental hands and yanked. "Get out of their heads," she yelled. She dumped every ounce of her restored energy down the connection. The feedback hit like shattering glass, and the control lines snapped all at once. The courtyard went completely quiet. The 10 wolves collapsed into the mud, whining as the black drained out of their eyes, and their normal gold bled back in. Silas dropped onto his knees. Dark blood ran from his nose, his jaw hanging slack. The rebound had wiped him out. There was nothing left behind his eyes but empty space. Talia slumped forward, the blue glow fading from her irises. Between the memory restoration and the psychic burn, her head felt like it was splitting open. She swayed, trying to get her legs under her. Cale caught her by the shoulders before she hit the dirt. He was back in human form, coated in mud and fresh blood, but his eyes were clear. He pulled her against his chest, and she let her forehead rest against his collarbone, feeling the rapid thump of his pulse. "Talia," he whispered. She reached up and touched his scraped jaw with shaking fingers. "I remember," she said. "I remember you." He didn't care about the rain or the blood on her face. He just held her tight, burying his face in her hair, while the two of them breathed in the quiet of the yard. The rebuilt pack house sat quiet in the mid-morning sun. Talia stood on the stone balcony overlooking the grounds, wearing an oversized sweater instead of her assembly uniform. The smell of ozone and old paper was gone. The mountain air just smelled like pine needles and damp earth. Down in the courtyard, things looked different. The lead from the old burial vault had been melted down and forged into a heavy gate for the new sanctuary wing. A few rogue psychics and local pack members were down there, stacking timber together. The madness that used to tear through the territory was gone. The wooden floorboards creaked behind her. She didn't turn around. She knew his step. Cale wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest and resting his chin on her hair. "Our home," he rumbled. She smiled and leaned back into his warmth. Deep in her mind, she felt a light brush against her thoughts. Not a voice, just a quiet, steady sense of comfort coming from his side of the bond. She let it sit there, watching the yard below as the sun cleared the trees.